Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Batman, The Doom That Came to Gotham. Now, The Doom That Came to Gotham is a graphic novel written by Mignola and Richard Pace and illustrated by Troy Nixey, and of course published by DC Comics. Now, this was originally published as a 3-issue comic book series, which was published between the years 2000 and 2001, but those 3 issues weren't actually published into trade paperback form until actually 2015. Now, Mike Mignola, the co-writer of this book, is also the creator of Hellboy. Now, I'll admit I'm not too familiar with Richard Pace's other works, but I know Troy Nixey, who illustrated this book, would also go on to direct the 2011 remake of Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. Now, this book is very much inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, this is also an Elseworld story, which means that it's not set in the mainstream Batman continuity. It's set completely in its own universe. Now, while this is definitely inspired by the works of Lovecraft, there is sort of a weird Catholicism angle to this story. Like, you very much get the idea that the Batman of this story has been chosen by God to stop these old ones. The issue with that is, though, if you actually read Lovecraft's stories, the concept of God really doesn't come into play in Lovecraft's stories. Like, Christianity and Catholicism was never really a big part of Lovecraft's philosophy. Like, actually, H.P. Lovecraft's stories are extremely nihilistic because the whole point of Lovecraft's stories is that what we think of as gods and demons are actually aliens, and they really don't give a fuck about us. In fact, in Lovecraft's stories, you find out that mankind's existence is essentially a joke, or it was like a genetic accident. And you very much get the idea that in the world of Lovecraft, there either is no God, or God is completely apathetic to the human race. But that's where this comic really does differ from the works of Lovecraft, because there's a lot of talk of the existence of God in this comic, and you very much get the idea that there is a God in the universe that this story takes place in, and you get this idea that Batman was chosen by God to stop these elder gods. So once again, while this is definitely inspired by Lovecraft's stories, it's not necessarily true to Lovecraft's philosophy. The book really does seem to be more so based on some of the characters of Lovecraft and some of the events of Lovecraft's stories. For example, this book has a variation on Mr. Freeze. However, the Mr. Freeze of this book is actually based on the character from H.P. Lovecraft's story, Cool Air. There's also sort of a variation on Killer Croc in this story. He's not actually called Killer Croc, but I guess it's sort of like a Lovecraftian-inspired Killer Croc. Also, Ra's al Ghul and Talia al Ghul are the 2 main villains of this story, but it's very much Lovecraftian takes on Ra's al Ghul and Talia al Ghul. For example, Ra's al Ghul in this story is clearly supposed to be a variation of the Mad Arab of H.P. Lovecraft's mythos. Poison Ivy is also in this story, but it's a very different take on Poison Ivy, and Harvey Dent, aka Two-Face, is also in this story as well, but the way Harvey Dent becomes Two-Face in this story and this particular version of Two-Face is completely different from anything you've ever seen before. Edrican the Demon is also a major character in this story, and so is the character of Oliver Queen, or Green Arrow. Even though he's not really Green Arrow in this story, you'll understand when you read it. One thing that's really interesting is this book actually features all 3 Robins all in the same timeline. So Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, and Tim Drake are actually major characters in this story, but they're not really Robin in the story, or at least you don't see them dress up as Robin, but essentially all three Robins are in this story. Oswald Cobblepot, aka the Penguin, is in this story as well. However, his role in the story is very similar to the H.P. Lovecraft story At the Mountains of Madness. So essentially in this book you see a bunch of familiar characters from either the Batman mythos or the DC continuity in general, but these are sort of new takes on the characters, and usually they have an either Lovecraftian or just a supernatural basis to them in this story. Another interesting Lovecraft reference is the character of Herbert West from Lovecraft's story Herbert West Reanimator actually makes a very brief appearance in this comic. Now, the plot of The Doom That Came to Gotham is, it's set in 1928, and once again, this is an Elseworld story, so it's set in a different continuity than what we're used to. But in the beginning of the story, you see Bruce Wayne and his three young wards, Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, and Tim Drake, going down to Antarctica to look for this professor named Oswald Cobblepot who disappeared on an expedition. Bruce Wayne discovers that this professor has discovered something buried in the ice, and what he discovered caused him to go insane, and he's essentially joined the Penguins now, and it's implied that he might be physically transforming into a penguin as well. Now, realizing that it's too late for Professor Cobblepot, they do discover somebody else down there, and they rescue him, but they discover that this guy needs to be kept in very cold temperatures, otherwise he'll rot. And this is obviously this book's version of Mr. Freeze, or this book's version of the character from Lovecraft's story Cool Air. So Bruce Wayne and his young wards return to Gotham, and apparently it's been years since Bruce has been to Gotham, and in this book you find out that when Bruce was a child, his parents were murdered right in front of him, but in this continuity it turns out that the reason his parents were murdered was because of who Thomas Wayne is, and you find out in this book that Thomas Wayne was not who he said he was. And it turns out that Bruce has actually been chosen to stop this coming apocalypse. And strange supernatural phenomena starts happening around Gotham City, including the city getting overrun by reptiles. So Bruce Wayne becomes Batman and tries to figure out what's going on, and he discovers that this woman named Talia al Ghul has come to Gotham City, and she can actually resurrect herself. And what happens is, in the story, Talia ends up bringing her dead father, Ra's al Ghul, back from hell, and now her and Ra's al Ghul are trying to bring forth this evil god into our world, and if that happens, it will be the end of the world as we know it. And it turns out that Batman is the only one who can stop this, but it might cost him. And that's the basic plotline of The Doom That Came to Gotham. Now, in general, I actually really enjoyed The Doom That Came to Gotham. My only complaints about this is I felt like there were a few missed opportunities. Like, I actually think they missed a major opportunity to have sort of like a Lovecraftian take on the Joker. Now, normally I don't care for it when they give the Joker an origin, but for this particular story, I think it would have been really interesting if like the Joker was some guy who finds out about the old ones and he goes insane, and that's the Joker of this story. Also, Arkham Asylum from the Batman mythos was actually named after a town from H.P. Lovecraft's stories, so I think it would have been really interesting if maybe you had a town called Arkham in this story, but it's like a town specifically built for insane people. Also, you have a lot of familiar Batman characters in this story, but sort of Lovecraftian takes on them. But I felt like a lot of the characters who show up in this, they just show up for like brief cameos. For example, Oswald Cobblepot, where he literally joins the Penguins. He's only in the beginning, and I felt like they could have done more with him. The same with Mr. Freeze in this story. They could have done so much more with him, and I think one of my complaints about this story is a lot of the characters who have these new backgrounds could have had a much bigger role to play in the story, but end up just showing up for like little cameo appearances. Also, even though I did enjoy this comic, I'm not sure if I can recommend it for hardcore Lovecraft fans, because even though it's clearly based on H.P. Lovecraft's stories, and it's clear that Mike Mignola and Richard Pace have read a lot of the stories that they're referencing, at the same time it sort of misses the point of what the philosophy of Lovecraft stories actually is. Because once again, there's sort of a Catholicism angle in this story, and this story sort of makes the Elder Gods more like literal demons. Now, I didn't mind that personally, but I could see that being a problem for hardcore Lovecraft fans. Like, honestly, if you want a better example of a Lovecraft-inspired comic book series than this, I recommend reading Alan Moore's Providence. But for what this was, I did enjoy the Doom That Came to Gotham. I just felt like it could have been more Lovecraftian, and I'm not sure if I can recommend it for die-hard Lovecraft fans. I do recommend it if you're a fan of Batman stories, and if you're a fan of Elseworld Batman stories, and you like seeing different takes on familiar characters. But despite its flaws, I do think it's pretty good, and I would recommend giving this comic a read. So yeah, that was my review on The Doom That Came to Gotham by Mike Mignola and Richard Pace, and bye.